Welcome to Learning Circles, an Indigenous perspective on psychological health and safety in the workplace. A special video series created to support employers across BC's tourism and hospitality industry. This series is a partnership between Len Pierre Consulting and Go2HR, BC's Tourism and Hospitality Human Resources and Health and Safety Association. Through these learning circles, we will explore how Indigenous values, knowledge systems, and lived experience can guide the creation of more supportive and psychologically safer workplaces. Let's begin this important journey of learning, reflection, and growth together. All right, welcome back to our next video lesson for this Learning Circle series for all of our friends and colleagues who work in the hospitality and tourism industry. This lesson is it is on shifting and moving in the direction of going from cultural awareness and shifting in more alignment with cultural advocacy. So I really look at cultural advocacy as good allyship. It's where we're being good partners, good friends, and taking up the movement for reconciliation, cultural safety, psychological safety for all the spaces where you might intersect with Indigenous colleagues and, of course, Indigenous communities. I love the word allyship because it implies that you're going to have somebody's back. So here are my most favorite teachings and tools from shifting from awareness to action. All right. So let's first start by defining what cultural advocacy is and how that relates to the good work of being a good ally to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So cultural advocacy is the active practice of using your role, your voice, and influence to challenge harm and support Indigenous peoples and create culturally safer systems, spaces, and experiences. Especially when it is uncomfortable or inconvenient. So think back to previous lessons on the relationship between Indigenous cultural safety and psychological safety. This is ultimately about workplace safety. So the big takeaway here is you do not need to be Indigenous to talk about or advocate for Indigenous cultural safety for the community members that might be working with your organization or agency, but also for the Indigenous peoples who might be employed within your organization as well. Now, in relationship to Indigenous allyship, allyship is ongoing. It's an accountable commitment to learning from Indigenous peoples, reflecting on your own power and privilege, and taking consistent action to reduce harm, share power, and support Indigenous self-determination. So with the over 200 First Nations communities that we have in this province, we need a very large workforce to get behind self-determination and honor Indigenous rights and honor the traditional lands and territories that all in tourism and hospitality industries, organizations, and agencies are built on. Now, here are my top 4 favorite tools when it comes to moving from awareness to advocacy. Number 1, take action. You may have heard of the phrase reconciliate action. I always say gone are the days where we're passive bystanders in witnessing or observing Indigenous experiences. In the era of truth and reconciliation, now is the time for the masses in the public sector, Indigenous, non-Indigenous peoples, to get behind the movement for reconciliation. And it doesn't have to require a huge degree of work. It's not rewriting your business plan. It's not rewriting your strategic plan or, sustainable things. Those are wonderful things. But the greatest moments of actually come from you as an individual. And one of the things that you can do that is no small thing is just commit to ongoing learning about Indigenous people's history and culture especially on the lands and territories where you live, work, and play. And ask yourself, train yourself to ask this question: what am I doing with this knowledge? It's important to know that silence and being a passive bystander in reconciliation does maintain harm. However, your action helps create a culture of safety, cultural safety, and of course, psychological safety. When we have everybody in the organization, Indigenous and non Indigenous staff, asking and talking about Indigenous things, it creates a culture and an environment where we feel safe to talk about these Indigenous things. Number two, use your role. Your position comes with a huge degree of influence. Whether you're the front desk clerk, whether you're the cook or the chef in the kitchen, whether you're a guide, whether you're a cultural advisor, or you're a manager, employer, or owner of the organization, all of our jobs come with a degree of influence. And I encourage folks to use their influence in your organization, in your team, to ask questions and advocate for reconciliation and Indigenous cultural safety. Number three, center Indigenous voices. The best learning comes from Indigenous peoples. So I always encourage professionals and staff to avoid speaking for Indigenous peoples, but instead you can still ask the question, you can still advocate without speaking on behalf of people and ask, whose voices should be heard here? And how can I support that? So please don't wait for an Indigenous person to be in the staff meeting, in the team meeting, to ask the question. You don't have to be Indigenous to pose those questions. But we do want to be mindful that we're not speaking on behalf of Indigenous communities or nations unless we have that partnership and understanding with those nations. And lastly, practice everyday allyship. The best change, transformation comes when we see a small part of ourselves as a part of this movement. Because reconciliation is a movement that's happening across this entire country. And we don't have to be part of the movement. We get to be part of the movement. So, on a more micro level, in hospitality and tourism, you can ask yourself, how are we welcoming guests? Non-Indigenous guests, tourists from across the planet, and how are we showing tourists from across the planet that they are in Indigenous land and territories? When you have Indigenous guests coming to your organization, we can ask ourselves, how are our Indigenous guests feeling? Do they feel psychologically safer? Do they feel culturally safer when they're accessing our hospitality and tourism organization? Are we open to feedback? How do we respond to feedback, especially if it's around unsafe practices? Do we hold it with dignity and space and grace? And of course, how can we support our own Indigenous colleagues who work with us in this organization? And of course, how can we hold ourselves to accountability? Those are my top 4 tools when it comes to shifting from awareness to advocacy. With that, I will see you in our next video lesson. Haichika.
As we close today's learning circle, thank you for joining us on this important path towards psychologically safer, healthier workspaces for everyone. This video is just one part of a multi-part series. We encourage you to watch the other sessions, each offering new insights and practical steps that you can take. Don't forget, additional tools and downloadable resources are available on GoToHR's website to guide your team's learning journey. Together, we are building workplaces rooted in understanding, inclusion, and psychological health and safety.